The school stood like a monument at the edge of town, its towering brick walls and iron gates casting long, possessive shadows over the cracked sidewalks. It was a place built for the few, not the many, a place where traditions were guarded like treasure and outsiders were made to feel the weight of their own inadequacy with every bell that tolled. From the first day she stepped through the gates, she understood the rules that no handbook ever printed. Her shoes, scuffed and too small, whispered her difference across the polished floors. Her uniform, a second-hand copy of the pristine models worn by the other girls, marked her as a visitor in their world, not a citizen. She carried her books cradled tightly against her chest, her hands trembling not from fear of the work but from fear of being noticed. Or worse, acknowledged. The courtyard was the heart of the school, paved in smooth white stone, framed by manicured gardens and framed murals of donors' names. In the center stood the coveted sunlit benches, broad, warm, inviting only to those who knew instinctively that they belonged. The first time she approached the benches, it was not in defiance but in hope. She had finished her assignments early, heart pounding with the tiny pride of success. She thought perhaps, just for once, she might sit where the sun touched the skin and laughter came easily. But before she could even lower herself onto the edge of the bench, a voice rang out across the courtyard, sharp and dismissive. "You can't sit here." The girl who spoke wore the crest of the student council on her blazer, her smile razor-thin, her polished shoes crossed casually atop the bench as if she were guarding a throne. A few others laughed, soft, cruel chuckles muffled behind perfect hands. Teachers nearby didn't intervene. They didn't even look up. The words hit harder than a slap. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply gathered her books in her arms and backed away, head bowed, the heavy silence of rejection pressing down on her like a second backpack. She found a cracked patch of concrete behind the gymnasium where the pipes leaked rust and the grass fought to survive between the stones. She sat there, alone, her books spread out on her knees, the sun hidden behind the towering walls. And there, in the quiet shadow of exclusion, she made a decision. They could deny her a bench. They could deny her a seat at their tables. They could even deny her the simple dignity of acknowledgement. But they could not deny her ambition. Every slight, every dismissal, every cold shoulder hardened her resolve. Each silent lunch, each lonely walk through the halls, each snubbed hand in group projects became a brick laid in a foundation deeper and stronger than they could ever imagine. She studied harder than anyone. When others coasted on their legacy admissions and family names, she stayed up long after the lights dimmed, working problems until her fingers cramped, reading texts until her vision blurred. She learned not just the curriculum but the architecture of the system that had been built to exclude her. She watched how privilege operated like an invisible currency, trading favors and access in ways the textbooks never mentioned. She mapped the alliances between teachers and parents, the unspoken codes etched into locker arrangements and seating charts. She learned to move in their world without accepting its rules. The girl they had tried to banish to the margins grew sharper, smarter, quieter, and more determined. She became invisible, but not in the way they intended. She became a ghost that haunted their victories, an unseen presence sharpening every contrast between what they had been given and what she had earned. By the time she crossed the stage at graduation, there were no cheers for her from the polished rows of proud parents. Her name passed quickly over the microphone, lost among the flood of easier, more familiar names. But it didn't matter. Because she understood something they never would. Real power isn't claimed by sitting on a bench someone else built. Real power is building the bench yourself. Building the school. Building the world. As she stepped down from the stage and into the bright, uncertain future, the memory of that first rejection, the words spat like venom across the courtyard, burned quietly in her chest. Not as a wound. As a promise. The world outside the iron gates was not kinder. It was wider, colder, and demanded a fierceness she hadn't yet learned to show. She stepped into it armed with nothing but worn notebooks filled with dreams no one else could see. There were no handshakes waiting for her at university, no scholarships gifted over whispered dinners among old family friends. Every piece of ground she claimed, she earned the hard way. Late nights in library basements, jobs no one else wanted, dorm rooms she shared with peeling ceilings and the steady hum of a heating unit that never quite worked. While others in bright clothes walked pathways paved with certainty, she wove her steps between cracks, carrying textbooks heavier than her own doubts, surviving on instant coffee and stubbornness. No one watched her struggle. No one marked the nights she spent piecing together tuition from 3 part-time jobs. No one noticed when she outscored her classmates on exams, when professors circled her papers with words like exceptional and brilliant only to raise an eyebrow when they saw her waiting in line at the cafeteria with her faded sneakers and frayed backpack. She didn't mind. Attention wasn't the goal. Building was. While her former classmates from the old school coasted into comfortable internships bought with family connections, she dug trenches with her own hands. She volunteered in programs no one cared to headline. She tutored children no one wanted to teach. She interned at nonprofits operating out of crumbling buildings with second-hand computers and filing cabinets older than she was. And all the while, she learned. Not just from books, but from the broken systems she moved through. She learned how funding flowed or didn't into education. She saw how decisions made in boardrooms 1,000 miles away could choke the future out of classrooms on the other side of town. She studied budgets, policies, zoning laws, the unseen machinery that shaped which schools thrived and which withered. Each experience became another piece of the blueprint unfolding in her mind, a new kind of school. A place where benches weren't reserved for the privileged few. A place where no child would be made to feel like they didn't belong. The vision burned so brightly inside her that some nights she couldn't sleep. She filled notebook after notebook with sketches, layouts of buildings with wide open spaces, classrooms built around collaboration instead of hierarchy, courtyards with no reserved seating, no invisible walls. She dreamed bigger than the world allowed. And when the world said no, she simply recalibrated her plan to find another door. After university, while others celebrated job offers and first apartments, she kept moving. She took work wherever it brought her closer to her dream. She taught in overcrowded classrooms where the lights flickered and the textbooks were missing half their pages. She worked night shifts sorting inventory in warehouses to pay for extra certifications. She attended city council meetings, sitting in the back with a legal pad, learning the language of grants and permits. Each step was quiet, invisible, deliberate. The years layered over her like sediment, each hardship compressing into something diamond-hard and unbreakable. Still, no one noticed. The old world she had left behind, the students who once claimed the sunny benches, the teachers who had turned their heads, the administrators who had smiled thinly as they pointed her toward the edges, had moved on without a thought for the girl they once dismissed. They didn't know she was still moving, still building, still planning. They didn't see her gathering knowledge like steel beams, laying foundations no one else could see, drafting blueprints on the blank spaces where others had left nothing but disdain. And she preferred it that way. Let them think she had disappeared. Let them forget her name. By the time they realized who she had become, the ground beneath them would already be shifting. Because success, real success, isn't built where everyone is looking. It's built in the blind spots they leave behind. And she was almost ready. The patch of land she found wasn't much to look at. From the road, it was a scar of cracked earth and weeds. A forgotten corner of town wedged between abandoned warehouses and empty lots. Rusted fences leaned like old men who had given up standing tall. Wind scattered trash along the curb where no one bothered to clean anymore. It was perfect. Where others saw rot, she saw potential. Where others saw a graveyard of hope, she saw the foundation for a revolution. The price was low, almost insultingly so. Developers had passed it over for years, dismissing it as worthless. She signed the deed with hands that had scrubbed floors, hauled boxes, carried the heavy weight of invisibility for too long. Now, finally, her hands would build. She spent the first few weeks clearing the land herself, pulling up weeds until her fingers bled, hauling broken concrete into battered dumpsters she rented 1 month at a time. She worked under the same burning sun that once blistered her bare feet, her determination now as relentless as the heat pressing against her back. At night, she sat cross-legged on the floor of her tiny apartment, blueprints spread out around her like battle plans. She couldn't afford the sleek architects or the high-priced firms the rich used to craft their monuments. But she didn't need glass towers and marble fountains. She needed something real. A school designed not to intimidate but to invite. Wide halls flooded with natural light. Courtyards open to all, with long benches carved from reclaimed wood. Classrooms without rows of desks like prison cells, but with circles, spaces that said, "You matter, your voice matters." Every wall was imagined not as a barrier, but as a bridge. She met with anyone who would listen. Construction workers, retired teachers, grant officers in tiny municipal offices. Most meetings ended in polite smiles and doorways closing behind her. But a few, just enough, saw what she saw. A few dared to believe. She built a coalition from the ground up. Masons who remembered what it felt like to be invisible kids. Electricians who once sat in the back of classrooms and pretended not to care because no one ever asked if they could. Volunteers trickled in, slow but steady, drawn by the magnet of her impossible dream. Supplies were scraped together through donated materials, discounts, second-hand sales. She made bricks from the discarded stones of a town that had thrown her away. Slowly, the outlines took shape, frames rising against the skyline like skeletal promises, foundations poured under the watchful eyes of a woman who never blinked. She wore a hard hat over her braids, work gloves fraying at the seams, her clipboard battered and covered with notes written in frantic scrawls. Every nail hammered into wood, every beam hoisted into place, sang the same silent anthem. This is ours. This is for everyone who was told they couldn't sit here. There were setbacks, of course. Deliveries delayed, permits caught in bureaucratic molasses, weather that drowned the half-finished playgrounds in mud. Each obstacle threatened to unmake her, but each time she bent without breaking, adjusted, learned, found another way. She lived at the site now, sleeping in a tiny trailer parked at the edge of the lot, waking with the birds to check blueprints and organize tasks. She showered at a friend's house when she could, ate whatever was fastest and cheapest. Every dollar not spent went into the school. Every single one. Some nights, as she sat in her trailer with calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug of cheap coffee, exhaustion clawed at her resolve. The world outside roared on, indifferent to the quiet miracle struggling into existence on its forgotten corner. But then she would remember the bench she had been pushed away from, the courtyard where laughter had frozen into weapons, the teachers who had watched and done nothing. She would remember the feeling of being told, silently and explicitly, that she didn't belong, and she would rise the next morning with new strength, because the blueprint was never just about a building. It was about creating a place where no child, no soul would ever be told again, "You can't sit here." The school grew beam by beam, nail by nail, hand by calloused hand. And it was almost ready. Not just for students. For history. The day the school opened, the sky was clear and wide, as if the universe itself had paused to witness what persistence could build. There were no banners strung between pillars. No ribbon-cutting ceremonies with city officials jostling for camera time. She didn't send out mass invitations or summon the media. She simply unlocked the doors, stepped back, and waited. Word had already spread. Not through billboards or ads, but through whispers, conversations, hope carried on the backs of parents who knew what it meant to see a child pushed aside. Through teachers tired of being told which children were worth saving. Through students who had never before seen a place built with them in mind. They came slowly at first. A young mother with a child gripping her hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. A boy with a tattered backpack held together by duct tape, eyes darting with a lifetime of suspicion. A girl in oversized sneakers scuffing nervously at the sidewalk, clutching a folder filled with dreams too fragile to say out loud. And when they crossed the threshold, something shifted. Gone were the polished marble floors meant to intimidate. Gone were the velvet ropes, the unspoken codes dictating who could sit where. Here, the halls were wide and bright, filled with murals painted by local artists and children alike. The benches in the courtyard were long and low, shaded by young trees that would one day tower into the sky. No one shouted orders. No one pointed fingers. No one said, "You can't sit here." Instead, teachers knelt to greet their students at eye level. Volunteers handed out books with smiles instead of judgment. Desks were arranged not in rigid rows but in circles and clusters, inviting collaboration instead of competition. She moved quietly through it all, clipboard in hand, adjusting schedules, answering questions, lifting chairs where needed. She didn't sit behind a grand desk or seal herself off in an office adorned with her name. She stayed visible, accessible, exactly as she had promised herself she would be. She watched the students spill into the courtyard during the first lunch break, hesitant at first. A few stood awkwardly, unsure where they were allowed to go. Years of invisible walls still hung heavy around them. And then a boy in a faded sweatshirt sat down at one of the long benches. Then another. Then a cluster of girls trading shy smiles. Within minutes, the benches were alive with chatter, laughter, the clatter of plastic trays, and swinging legs. There were no signs dividing space. No glances sharp enough to cut. Only sunlight, laughter, and the messy, glorious noise of belonging. She stood at the edge of the courtyard, unnoticed, and let herself breathe it in. Across town, the old school still stood. Still towering, still cold. But its prestige had begun to hollow out from within. Enrollment dipped. Whispered stories circulated about favoritism, about students who slipped through cracks no one cared to patch. Teachers who once fought to join its ranks quietly sought transfers elsewhere. They couldn't see the rot yet, not fully. But they would. Because real strength didn't lie in exclusion. It lay here, in the dust-streaked sunlight catching on scraped knees and notebooks sprawled across benches. In the fearless way a child claimed space simply because they trusted it was theirs. Later that afternoon, after the students had gone home, she walked through the empty halls, running her hand lightly along the smooth walls, feeling the pulse of the place she had built. Each classroom held echoes now, not of lectures barked from podiums, but of conversations of curiosity unchained. In one room, a half-erased whiteboard read, "What do you want to build today?" She smiled. It wasn't perfect yet. There were still budgets to stretch. Supplies to scrounge, broken systems to battle. But it was a beginning. And beginnings were powerful. Especially when born from all the doors once slammed in your face. That night, she sat outside on the same courtyard benches the children had claimed that morning. She leaned back, the coolness of the stone against her spine grounding her to the earth, the stars above blinking like ancient witnesses. Here she was. Not as a guest. Not as an outsider begging permission to sit. But as the architect of a new story. A story where no one would ever again hear, "You can't sit here." Because there would always be room. Because there would always be light. Because she had built it that way. The shift wasn't immediate, but it was irreversible. At first, the old school barely noticed. They still sent out glossy newsletters filled with carefully posed photographs and hollow mission statements. They still hosted banquets where alumni in tailored suits toasted themselves for preserving tradition. They still measured success in the width of their marble staircases and the pedigree of last names etched onto donor plaques. But something had changed, and it ran deeper than anything their polished brochures could fix. Families who once waited months on end to enroll their children there began hesitating. Whispers spread in coffee shops and grocery aisles, murmurs about a new school across town, a place where kids weren't sorted into invisible hierarchies the moment they arrived, a place where creativity wasn't just tolerated but celebrated. At first, the old school dismissed it. "It's a fad," they said. "An experiment. They'll come back once they realize the importance of discipline, of tradition." But the faces in their classrooms grew fewer. The laughter ringing through their halls grew thin and forced. Teachers who wanted to teach, not manage reputations, began quietly sending resumes elsewhere. And still, across town, her school grew. One evening, a delegation from the old school showed up unannounced, hoping to observe the place they had once considered beneath their notice. A few teachers, a vice principal with a tight smile, and a board member whose hands shook slightly as he adjusted his silk tie. They walked the halls, expecting chaos, expecting disorder, expecting proof that they were right all along. Instead, they found students sprawled across colorful rugs in circles, debating literature with a fire in their voices. They found science labs humming with experiments run by students' own designs. They found teachers laughing with students, not at them, forging bonds stronger than any resume line. They found art filling the walls, not the sterile portraits of benefactors, but wild, vivid splashes of color painted by the students themselves. Most disorienting of all, they found no hierarchy to hide behind. No unspoken rules separating the valued from the tolerated. Every child moved through the space like they belonged. Because they did. One of the visitors, a woman who had once watched the barefoot girl be humiliated on the courtyard bench without lifting a finger, lingered near the main office. On the wall behind the receptionist's desk, there was a photograph framed in simple wood. It showed the founder of the school, smiling faintly, hard hat perched atop her head, standing in the middle of a half-built courtyard surrounded by workers. No ribbon, no press conference, no spotlight. Just her. Something about the woman's face tugged at the visitor's memory, but it couldn't be. Could it? The realization hit like a slow, drowning weight. It was her. The girl they had pushed aside. The girl they had made invisible. Not just present now. In charge. Owner of the land they had forgotten. Builder of a future they no longer had a place in. The board member fumbled to recover, suggesting collaborations or joint programs with the new school. But the suggestion fell flat, the way a rusted coin clinks uselessly against marble. There would be no partnerships. No salvaging the old pride with the new hope she had built. She wasn't interested in patching up the system that had failed her. She was busy replacing it. When the delegation left, their steps were slower, their posture a little less straight. They didn't speak as they climbed into their polished cars. The weight of what they had lost. Not through violence, not through lawsuits, but through irrelevance, settled into their bones. It was too late. They hadn't just lost students. They had lost the future. Meanwhile, she stood in the courtyard at sunset, watching her students paint a new mural along the garden wall. 1,000 colors splashed across the concrete, a living testament to everything the old world said wasn't possible. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vindictive. She was simply certain, in a way few ever are, that she had done the one thing they never believed she could do. She hadn't just found a seat. She had built the whole school. And she wasn't finished yet. The new courtyard bustled with life, a patchwork of voices, footsteps, and laughter stitching itself into the afternoon air. Students leaned against the long benches, books open, conversations alive with ideas and debates. A girl in a bright yellow jacket perched cross-legged atop a table, sketching wildly into a notebook. Nearby, a boy and girl argued animatedly about physics, waving their hands as if trying to sculpt the laws of nature into something new. No one looked over their shoulder for permission. No one asked if they belonged. No one told them where they could or couldn't sit. The bench that once symbolized exclusion, the one that had seared itself into her memory, that had fueled years of quiet, stubborn ambition, was nowhere here. Not because there were no benches, but because the concept of ownership over space had been erased. Every patch of grass, every seat, every hallway belonged to them all. She stood at the edge of the courtyard now, unseen by most, a clipboard loosely held in one hand, a faint smile curving her lips. The sun slanted low, casting long shadows, and the colors of the murals rippled under the breeze like living mosaics. She didn't need a plaque bolted to the wall with her name. She didn't need a gilded statue or a title embroidered in gold thread. The proof of what she had built was in the life thrumming all around her, in the easy confidence of students who knew no gatekeeper could shut them out, in the teachers whose laughter echoed louder than the old iron bells that once demanded silence. She had rewritten the rules in the only language that mattered: trust, dignity, and relentless hope. A reporter had visited the week before, asking for a feature story on her journey, the barefoot girl who had built the school. She had politely declined. Let the story belong to the students now. Let the spotlight stay where it mattered. This wasn't her finish line. It was their starting line. Across the street, the old school's gates stood rusted and closed. The building, once so proud and imposing, now sagged under the weight of its own irrelevance. The marble courtyard was cracked. The benches sat empty, bleached gray by time and rain. She had driven by once or twice, feeling no triumph, only a deep, serene detachment. They had taught her that power was a place you were granted access to, a seat at a table, a spot on a bench. They were wrong. True power was building a place so open, so alive, that no one needed to ask where they could sit, because the answer was everywhere. As the sun dipped lower, she tucked her clipboard under her arm and walked through the courtyard. Students waved as she passed. One boy rushed up to ask if he could start a new club, something about coding and community gardens. "Of course," she said simply. "Build it." She moved on, her boots scuffing lightly against the smooth concrete, passing benches filled with kids who hadn't yet learned to measure themselves by the judgments of others, and who, if she had anything to say about it, never would. In a far corner of the yard, where the sunlight lingered longest, there was a small stone slab set into the ground. Unmarked, uncelebrated, easy to miss. Only if one bent close would they see the engraving. "Everyone deserves a place to grow." No names, no dates, no history lessons. Just a truth written in stone for anyone willing to look down and remember how high they could rise. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. She walked forward, past the benches, past the walls, into the living, breathing future she had built with her own two hands. The barefoot girl who had been told she didn't belong. The girl who didn't just find a place at the table. The girl who built the whole damn house and left the door wide open behind her.